Hello everyone, I'm Edgar Torres and today I will do a quick tutorial on how to handle data in your workspace in MATLAB. Previously, we went over how a little bit on introduction on the MATLAB software, so I showed you a couple of buttons that you will need to, and we took a look around MATLAB. So now I want to teach you a little bit more on how to use it. So the biggest thing that you want to get used to is getting used to the editor. As I said on the first video, you can think of your editor as if you're writing an essay. So right here, this is code that you're going to be creating, that you're going to be writing yourself. All of this is going to be saved into a file. So you can always save it, close it, and anytime you can open it back. So one of the very essentials of MATLAB is learning how to code in MATLAB. So today I will be showing you a couple of the different data structures that MATLAB supports. One of the key things as programming is understanding variables. So now what is a variable? So right here in our workspace as we had before, so let me just remove this. We can see that whenever we create a variable by typing a name, followed by an equal sign, and then a value, it will go directly into the workspace. So let's start from the beginning. Ignore those commands. I will be explaining a little bit more what those commands mean. But right now, all they did was just erase the workspace. So again, how to create a variable? First, type a variable name. So this name can be any name you want. Just make sure to start with a letter and avoid using symbols. So for example, don't use the dollar sign, don't use exclamation mark. So for example, I can call this my variable. You can use numbers, just make sure that the variable name doesn't start with a number. So this will be invalid, but this would be valid. So I want to create a variable called my variable. The next thing is that we use an equal sign to declare the variable. So that's an important word. Declare. A declaration means that we're giving a value to a variable. So to do that, all you have to do is just put in a value. So this right here, this is what's known as a declaration. I am declaring that my variable will now have a value of 5. So if I were to run this, as you can see right now, the command window is telling me my variable now has a value of 5. And anytime I can check my workspace, and I can see right here that my variable has a value of 5. So now that we create a variable, we can access that variable. So what do I mean by access? So MATLAB already knows, thanks to the workspace, that my variable has a value of 5. So now at any time I can access this variable to retrieve its value. So for example, let's say that I am creating some sort of like physics question. So let's pretend that, for example, this is a force value. And we're just going to say 10. And we can call this newtons. And let's say that we have an acceleration of 9.81. And we can say that this is meters per second squared. And let's say that we know that thanks to Newton's second law, that force is equal to mass times acceleration. So I want to access the mass of this object. So what I can do is that I can write it down kind of like a formula. So again, remember, first we have the variable has to go in. So I'm going to do m. And then I can access these variables by simply typing their names. So if I do f over a, and again, notice how the name f matches. Notice how the name a matches. I'm going to click run. And as you can see, it calculated the mass. A couple of important points. The variable that you're declaring has to always be on the left. So for example, if you were to do something like this will not work. So if I were to run this, as you can see, this errors. The variable that you're declaring has to always be on the left. So now about the semicolons that I've been using. The semicolons is what is known as suppression. What does suppression means? So for example, let's say that I do x is equal to 1, and then I click run. Notice how in my command window, it's informing me that x is equal to 1. So now I'm going to remove everything. So now look at what happens when I put in the semicolon and I click run. Nothing happens. And again, let me remove it and click run. Whenever you have a semicolon, it suppresses the value from appearing in the command window. And typically you want to make sure that all your declarations are suppressed. So you want to avoid having semicolons cut off like this. There are times where you don't want semicolons whenever you're doing certain things like debugging code. But once you're done with everything, you want to make sure that everything is suppressed. Unless if you're purposefully wanting to show the value or you don't want it suppressed, but typically you want them suppressed. So now, right now, we've been looking at variables and we've been looking that we can save numbers. But MATLAB offers a lot of different data structures. So I want to access a couple of them. First I'm going to write down a list. So for example, we have numbers, we have vectors, we have matrices, we have strings, we have anonymous functions. So these are the five, oh, let me just change that. So these are the five different type of data types that you will pretty much be using for this course. Of course, there's many more stuff that you can actually save, but for right now, these are the five important ones that we're going to be dealing with. So as I said right now, for a number, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is just type a variable name and simply set it to a number. But MATLAB also supports vectors. So now how do we type in a vector? You type in the variable name, and of course, this can be any variable name that you want. So I can call this my vector. And to create a vector, you use brackets. So for example, let's create the vector 1, 2, 3. All you have to do is type in the values and just leave a space between them. If you want to, you can also add commas, but those are optional. So I'm going to run this. And as you can see in my workspace, because remember, every variable you create will appear in your workspace. It created a vector with the values 1, 2, and 3. When you're creating a vector, you can also create column vectors by using semicolons in between the values. So if I were to run this, as you can see right there in my workspace, it now has semicolons. And right here, if you double click the variable in the menu, it will open up a spreadsheet. So as you can see, because we use semicolons, it created them as a column vector. If I were to go back and change these back to just spaces or just regular commas, and I click run, you can see that now there is a row vector. So just keep that in mind whenever you're creating a vector, whether you need a row vector or a column vector. So now MATLAB offers vectors, and you can also do all of the typical operations that you're used to with vectors. So what do I mean by that? For example, let's go back to our command window and just type in the vector 1 and 2 times 3 and 4. So now what do you think would happen if I click enter? It errors because this is not valid vector multiplication. Whenever you're multiplying vectors, you usually want them to be a row and column. So now that we fix this mistake, what do you think is going to happen? We get 11. Why is that? It's because it's doing the cross product. If we do the cross product ourselves, we would see we'll get 3 times 1, which is 3, plus 4, plus 2 times 4, which is 8. So 8 plus 3, that is 11. So all of the typical operations that you're used to with vectors like cross product, dot product, vector division, vector addition, vector subtraction, MATLAB offers all of these things. So for example, let's do something simpler. 1 and 2 plus the vector 3 and 4. As you can see, it created a vector with two values being 4 and 6. And if we do this operation in our head, we can see it's correct. 3 plus 1, 4. 4 plus 2, 6. So you can pretty much in MATLAB, you can create vector values and you can pretty much just do any operations that you're used to with them normally, like if they were just a number. And of course, you keep this in mind once you start getting later into the class. These types of operations can be really useful and really handy. So the next type of value I want to talk about are matrices. So let me just move some stuff. So now how do we create matrices in MATLAB? Simple. So I'm going to create a variable. Oops, my matrix. And what we're going to do is that we're going to write every single row. So for example, 1, 2, and 3. And to create a new line, we use the semicolon. So I'm going to create this matrix. I'm going to click run. So as you can see, it appears in our workspace. So I'm going to show you how it looks like. So this is how our matrix looks in the workspace. So as you can see, we have 1, 2, and 3 in the same row because we just use commas to separate these. After the 3 is when we have a semicolon. So as you can see, because of the semicolon, it does a new line, and then we get 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. So you can use these semicolons to essentially create a new row. So if I were to come back here and do 7, 8, and 9, I'm going to click run. And as you can see, we now have 7, 8, and 9. The 7, 8, and 9 appear in a new vector because I used a semicolon to separate the rows. If this gets a little bit confusing, you can also do this, where instead of using semicolons, use a new line, like so. And now if I click run, as you can see, everything still stays the same. So if I were to do 10, 11, 12, and you can also add spaces to make things look a little bit nicer. And I click run, and as you can see, 10, 11, 12. So if you don't want to use semicolons, you can also use new lines to format your matrix. And just like with vector values, you have access to all of the things that you have access to all of the operations you can do with matrix. So you can add matrices, you can subtract matrices, multiply matrices, invert matrices, divide by matrices. These things that you're used to. Although typically you're not going to be encountering a lot of those in this course, but it's something really nice to know, especially for other classes where sometimes you may want to double check if you're multiplying matrices correctly. Something nice to learn. So now the next data type of value that MATLAB supports are strings. So what is a string? You can think of it as a piece of text. So for example, I can do my string, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use quotation marks, and I can write text like hello. So now look at what happens when I click run. As you can see, the string hello has been saved into my variable. Let me get that window out of the way. Okay, so as I was saying, um, I've created the string hello, and if we look at our workspace, we can see that my string now contains the value hello. Um, you're probably not going to be encountering this too much in MATLAB, but it is important to know what a string is. So a string is just a piece of text. You're not going to be handling variables with strings too often in this class, but there'll be certain times where you would have to use them for displaying, printing, and formatting certain stuff. But just if you're ever confused on what a string is, just think of it as text. It's just text. It's text that is stringed together, letter by letter. So that's where the names come from, string. So now the final data structure that you probably want to get used to for this course are anonymous functions. So what is an anonymous functions? You can think of them as a very nice shortcut to formulas. So I'm first going to create one because I think that's a little bit easier to explain when you see one. So I'm going to do my func, and this is how you create anonymous functions. And make sure you remember this. Oftentimes I see a lot of students create anonymous functions incorrectly. The way you create an anonymous function is that you use the at symbol, open parentheses, you create a variable, so you can choose any name, for example, x, close parentheses, and then inside here we can write any expression. So for example, to start off, I'm going to do x squared. So I'm going to click run. Okay. So as you can see, in the workspace, we can see that my function now has that anonymous function. And even looking at the command window, we can see my function is now equal to function handle x squared. So what is an anonymous function? Look at what happens when I type in my func, open parentheses, and I type the number 5, like this. As you can see, it automatically got this 5, and it plugged it in into this equation for me. So this is the way they work. Inside these parentheses, you declare your inputs. So this is what's going to be going into the function. Afterwards, we create an expression. So we'll use the inputs you declared, and it will run them through whatever expression you want. And then finally, it will return the whole thing as an output. Once you create an anonymous function, all you have to do is type in the variable name that holds your anonymous function, open parentheses, you put your input, close parentheses. So now we can try it again. My func, let's put the number 2. And as we can see, 2 squared is 4. And you can create a lot of cool stuff with these. For example, let's do x squared plus 5. I'm going to click run. So as you can see, we have x squared plus 5. So if I call in my func, and let's do 5 again. Now I'm getting 30. Again, why? The 5 is being plugged in. So it's going to be 5 squared, which is 25, plus 5, 30. So this whole function returns 30. So these are going to be really handy to use whenever you have a formula in class. So you can create an anonymous function. You simply declare any inputs. You type in your formula, and now you can access this. So for example, let's create an anonymous function. Let's create a function for finding area of a triangle. So area of triangle. I'm going to use the equal to declare. And again, remember, at symbol, open parentheses, and here's where we create our inputs. So for this one, we're going to be needing the base and height of the triangle. Oops, height of the triangle. So we're going to be needing two inputs, the base and the height. So to do that, all we have to do is just, here's where we declare the inputs. So I'm going to be typing B for base, H for height. And as you can see, I separate my inputs using commas. So now all we have to do is just type in the formula, which we know is base times height divided by 2. So I'm going to run this. And as you can see, area of triangle with inputs B and H, expression B times H divided by 2. So now to call this, I just type in area of triangle, and I can just put in any two values that I want, like 5, and let's try 6, 5 and 6. I'm going to click enter, and we can test this ourselves. So we know 5 times 6, 5 times 6, that is 30, divided by 2, 15. So right now we're using really basic formulas, but you can put in any type of complicated function that you want in here. And these anonymous functions can be a huge lifesavers. Um, Try to remember these, especially once you get deeper into the course. Whenever you say a formula, your first instinct should be, I can anonymize that formula into a function. And you will see that that will help you a lot. So right now for, I guess, homework, I want you to open up your MATLAB and I want you to try out all of these different data types. So I want you to experiment with vectors, I want you to experiment with matrices, I want you to experiment with strings, and I especially want you to experiment with anonymous functions. If you ever need help with how to use MATLAB, do you remember that you can always Google it? MATLAB has a very good documentation online. So if you ever need help, it is just a matter of going to Google, typing in MATLAB, and then you can type whatever you need help with. So for example, if you need help working with vectors, you can just type in MATLAB, how to multiply a vector, and just see what Google shows you. Usually you will find a lot of useful content online. As I said before, I really do want you to experiment with MATLAB and try messing around with these variables. I want you to be very comfortable with creating variables and using variables. This should be something as a second instinct. Get used to being able to see the workspace and understanding how the workspace works. Working with variables is the very fundamental of MATLAB, and it can be a little bit confusing at first, especially if this is the first time that you ever create any type of script. And I understand that it can be a little bit tricky, especially if this is your first time doing it, but it's better to start right now early in the class. If you ever need any more help, you can always ask your professor or you can attend the tutoring center that we have. We have the science lab, which offers help with engineering classes. So it's a little bit of a quick recap. In order to create a variable, you simply type in the name. And again, it can be any name that you want to. If you're working with, for example, like a physics problem, you can call it normal force. Oops. For example, this is an acceptable name. You can also use underscores, and you can also use numbers. So if you want to call something x1, x2, x3, that is perfectly fine. In order to declare a value, you have the variable name followed by an equal sign and some type of value. If you want to access a variable, all you have to do is type in the variable name. So for example, something like this is perfectly valid. Do you remember that something like this does not work? So the variable that you're trying to declare has to always be on the left. So if we're trying to declare x3, x3 has to be to the left of the equal sign. So if I run this, as you can see, everything is working just as intended. The semicolons are to suppress your values. That stops them from appearing in the command window. It is generally good for you to always suppress your values. The reason why you wouldn't want them suppressed if you're trying to do some type of debugging to make sure that your script is working correctly. And finally, the 5 type of data values that are important in MATLAB are your numbers, your vectors, your matrices, your strings, and your anonymous functions. So get comfortably understanding what these data types are. And with that, I will finish this video. Goodbye.